My stepmother wore white to my father's while reading. Not all white. Cream. Tasteful. Exactly the kind of color a woman wears when she already knows she's won. She sat with her hands folded, smiling at the lawyer like he was about to read her own eulogy of triumph. She had every reason to smile. For 15 years, she had managed my father the way she managed everything. Quietly, completely, one small adjustment at a time, until the man I grew up with was rearranged into someone who barely recognized his own son at Thanksgiving. The lawyer cleared his throat and opened a folder that wasn't the one Diane was expecting. "Before we begin," he said, "I need to read something your husband recorded himself for years ago in this office without you." I watched the smile stay on her face for exactly 3 more seconds. Then it didn't. My father, Walter Donovan, built a fastener and machine parts company out of a single rented garage in Erie, Pennsylvania, the kind of business nobody outside this country fully appreciates until they need a bolt that has to hold something together at 60,000 feet. He worked the floor himself for the first 11 years. My mother, Eleanor, kept the books and raised my sister Claire and me in a house that smelled like coffee and machine oil. In the good way, the way a house smells when both things mean somebody's home is being held up by real labor. My mother died of ovarian cancer when I was 16. I won't dwell on those 2 years, except to say that grief like that doesn't really end. It just learns to sit quietly in a different room of the house. And my father, who had never in his life learned to talk about feelings out loud, simply closed a door on that room and never opened it again. He buried himself in the company instead. It was the only language he trusted. He met Diane about 3 years later at a Chamber of Commerce dinner. She was polished in a way our family had never been. Good schools, a tennis club upbringing, a divorce behind her with 2 kids from her first marriage, Connor and Madison, both a little younger than me. She was, to be fair to her, genuinely charming in those early years. She brought a kind of order and brightness back into a house that had gone gray with grief, and for a while, I was grateful to her for that. The way you're grateful to anyone who turns a light back on in a room you'd forgotten was dark. The changes were small at first. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of story. It never starts with a slammed door. It starts with a missing photograph. My mother's pictures came off the mantle within the first year, replaced gradually with photos of Diane's side, of vacations I hadn't been invited to plan, of a version of the family that had quietly started without waiting for me to notice I'd been left off the guest list. Christmas changed shape too. We'd always opened presents Christmas Eve, a tradition from my mother's side. Candles lit, my father reading the same Dickens passage every year in a voice that embarrassed all of us, and that we secretly loved. By the third Christmas with Diane, we were doing Christmas morning at her parents' country club instead, a brunch with a string trio, and the Dickens reading just quietly stopped happening, the way traditions do when nobody fights hard enough to keep them and somebody else is fighting hard enough to replace them. I want to be fair to my father here, because this isn't a story where he's a villain either. He was a man from a generation that believed providing was the whole of love, that if the lights stayed on and the tuition got paid, the rest would sort itself out. He didn't see the photographs disappearing. Or he saw it and told himself it wasn't worth the fight it would take to stop it, the same way he'd told himself for 2 years after my mother died that it wasn't worth talking about how he felt, because talking wouldn't bring her back. What he didn't account for was how much weight silence carries when you stack enough of it on top of a person. By the time I was 25, married, and starting my own small engineering consultancy 2 states away, I had become, in the language of that house, the one who moved on. Connor, meanwhile, who had shown zero interest in fasteners or machine parts his entire life, had somehow become the one who stayed close to his father, despite living 40 minutes away and visiting roughly as often as I did when I made the trip back for holidays. I didn't notice the rebalancing happening in real time. Nobody ever does. You only see the shape of it years later, the way you only really see a riverbed once the water's gone. I married Sarah the summer I turned 26. She was a trauma nurse, the daughter of a long-haul trucker and a school cafeteria worker, the kind of woman who could set a broken finger and talk you through a panic attack in the same 5 minutes. and I loved her immediately for exactly the reasons Diane found her unsuitable. I remember the engagement dinner clearly, because it was the first time I watched Diane's particular skill in action up close. Not cruelty, never cruelty, just a kind of surgical, smiling diminishment. She asked Sarah about her people, and when Sarah mentioned her father drove freight, Diane said, brightly, "How wonderfully hardworking," in a tone that managed to compliment and erase a person in the same breath. My father didn't catch it. Diane's children, Connor and Madison, exchanged a look I caught out of the corner of my eye, the kind of look people give each other when they already know which family member just got quietly filed under "not quite us." It got worse, in the slow, deniable way these things always do. When Connor got engaged 2 years later to a woman whose family owned 3 regional dealerships, my father and Diane threw an engagement party at the club with 80 guests and a band. When Sarah and I had our first child, the gift that arrived was a generic card with a $50 check, the same amount, I later learned, that Diane sent to her hairdresser's daughter's baby shower. I started keeping track without meaning to. Connor's wedding, fully funded, no number ever discussed out loud, though I'd guess close to $70,000 by the time the open bar and the destination rehearsal dinner were added up. Madison's boutique business, capitalized with a family loan that nobody ever once mentioned repaying. My own consultancy, when it nearly folded in its second year during a slow stretch for industrial clients, got a single conversation with my father that ended with him saying, not unkindly, "You'll figure it out, Eric. You always do." I did figure it out, for the record. I want to say that clearly, because this isn't a story about a man waiting for a handout. I rebuilt that business twice over the next decade into something I'm genuinely proud of. But there's a particular kind of loneliness in figuring it out alone, while watching your step-siblings get handed solutions to problems you weren't even allowed to have witnessed. The loneliness of being trusted to survive, instead of being loved enough to be helped. The business, my father's business, the one with his name still on the building, became the clearest battlefield, even though nobody ever called it that. Connor started helping out on weekends around the time he turned 30, despite an engineering degree he'd never used and zero hands-on plant experience. Within 3 years, he had a title, Director of Strategic Operations, that nobody on the floor could fully explain the function of, but that positioned him, unmistakably, as the heir apparent to a company built by a man whose own son had spent 15 years training as an actual mechanical engineer and had offered, more than once, to come back and run operations for real. Each time I offered, my father found a reason it wasn't the right moment. "Things are settled right now, Eric. Let's not upset the balance." I understand now what he meant by balance. He meant Diane's balance. He meant the quiet, exhausting equilibrium he maintained by never directly choosing between the family he built with my mother and the family he built around her absence. It was easier, always, to let the second family expand into the space the first family had vacated through death and distance, than to ever say out loud that the expansion had a cost, and that the cost had a name, and the name was mine. My father's heart started failing properly when he was 71. Nothing dramatic at first, a stent, a change in medication, doctor's orders to slow down that he treated as a suggestion rather than an instruction. I flew back more often during that stretch, every 6 weeks instead of twice a year, and that's when I started noticing things that, individually, looked like nothing, but together looked like a pattern with a purpose. Phone calls to the house started going through Diane more often than not. "He's resting. I'll have him call you back," which he sometimes did, 2 or 3 days later, sounding slightly confused about what we were supposed to be discussing. Visits had to be scheduled around his energy levels, which in practice meant scheduled around whatever Diane had already planned that week. Connor's kids' soccer games, Madison's gallery openings, the kind of family calendar I was now a guest star in rather than a recurring character. There was one visit, about 18 months before he died, that I think about more than any other. I drove up unannounced, which I rarely did, but Sarah had pushed me to, said I needed to see him without the choreography for once. I found him alone in his study, a room Diane had redecorated twice since my mother's death, but had never quite managed to make feel like anyone's, looking through an old photo album I didn't recognize. When he saw me, his face did something I hadn't seen it do in years. It opened, completely, the way a face opens around someone it trusts without having to think about it first. We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon. Real talk, the kind we hadn't had since before my mother died. He asked about my work with an attentiveness that felt like an apology nobody was going to say out loud. He asked about his grandchildren by name, correctly, including details I hadn't told him in months, which told me he'd been keeping track quietly, on his own, maybe in that same study, maybe in that same album. Then Diane came home early from wherever she'd been, and I watched the openness in his face close again. Not because he didn't want it open, I genuinely believe that, but because some old, practiced part of him had learned that keeping the peace meant performing a slightly different version of himself in her presence. He introduced the visit, almost apologetically, as Eric just stopping by. The way you describe an old friend rather than your only son, and I understood, watching him do it, that he was protecting me as much as he was protecting himself, softening my presence into something small enough that it wouldn't disturb whatever fragile arrangement kept his household running without conflict. I didn't get angry that day, which surprised me. I got something closer to clarity. I understood, driving home, that my father had built two completely different emotional economies. One for the world he'd shared with my mother and me, where love was demonstrated through labor and presence even when it wasn't spoken, and one for the world Diane had built around him, where love was something closer to compliance, maintained by never asking him to choose. He'd been living a kind of quiet double life for 15 years, not out of dishonesty, but out of exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who'd already grieved once and never wanted to find out what fighting for something and losing it again felt like a second time. I started visiting more after that, scheduling around Diane when I had to, showing up unannounced when I could get away with it. I told myself I was doing it for him. I think, if I'm honest, I was also doing it because some old, stubborn part of me still believed that if I just stayed present enough, long enough, the real version of my father, the one from that one afternoon in the study, would eventually win out over the performed one. I didn't know yet that he'd already started fighting that exact battle himself, quietly, in a lawyer's office I knew nothing about. About a year before he died, my father had a second cardiac event, more serious than the first, and spent 11 days in the hospital. I flew in within 6 hours of getting the call from Madison, of all people, not Diane, not Connor, which I didn't think much of at the time, but which I understand differently now. Those 11 days were strange in ways I still haven't fully processed. Diane was attentive, genuinely, sleeping in the hospital recliner most nights, and I want to give her that credit honestly, because exaggerating someone into a cartoon villain helps no one understand what actually happens in families like mine. But she was also, during that same window, deeply involved in conversations with hospital administrators and his cardiologist about his long-term care planning that somehow always seemed to happen in the 10 minutes I'd stepped out for coffee. On the fourth day, my father asked the nurse to step out and asked me, very quietly, with tubes still in his arm, whether I still had Mr. Halloran's number. Halloran had been our family's lawyer since before I was born, a man Diane had quietly eased out of the family's affairs over the previous decade in favor of her own longtime estate attorney, a smooth, expensive man named Greaves who handled, among other things, her side of a prenuptial agreement that none of us kids had ever been allowed to see the terms of. I told him I did. He said, "Don't tell Diane I asked," and then immediately looked embarrassed for having said it. The way you look embarrassed catching yourself doing something that contradicts the story you've been telling about your own marriage for 15 years. I didn't push. I called Halloran from the parking garage that same afternoon, gave him my father's room number, and didn't ask questions, because some instinct in me understood that whatever was happening needed to happen quietly, on my father's terms, without me turning it into a confrontation he wasn't strong enough to survive having. Halloran visited twice more over the following year, always announced to the family as old friends catching up, always scheduled, I noticed, on days Diane had standing tennis lessons. I didn't know what they discussed. I genuinely didn't ask, Partly out of respect, partly, I'll admit, out of fear. Fear that asking would make whatever fragile thing my father was quietly building disappear before it had the chance to matter. What I didn't know was that something in my father had shifted after that hospital stay. He started calling me more, on his own, from a cell phone Diane didn't know he'd started carrying separately, a cheap prepaid one he kept in his nightstand. He asked questions about my kids' college plans, about Sarah's job, about whether the consultancy could handle a few more years of growth if it needed to. A question I didn't understand the weight of until much later. He started, in small, careful ways, rebuilding a relationship with the version of himself that existed before grief and exhaustion had handed the architecture of his life over to someone else's blueprint. I didn't know it was a final project. I thought, the way you always think with parents whose health has stabilized again, that we had years left to keep rebuilding slowly. We had 14 months. He used every one of them more deliberately than I understood at the time, laying groundwork I wouldn't see the shape of until I was sitting across from a lawyer in a room that smelled like my childhood, watching my stepmother's smile freeze in real time. My father died on a Tuesday in March, at home, in his sleep, which the cardiologist said was about as merciful an ending as that particular disease ever offers. I got the call from Madison again, not Diane, at 6:40 in the morning, her voice flat with a kind of shock that made me trust, for the first time in years, that whatever performance existed in that house, grief itself was not part of it. The funeral was, predictably, exactly the kind of event Diane was built to produce flawlessly, tasteful, well-attended, catered with a precision that would have made my mother's simple, candlelit Christmas Eves look almost embarrassingly modest by comparison. 300 people came through the receiving line. The eulogy, delivered by a pastor who'd known my father for exactly the 15 years Diane had been arranging his calendar, described a man I recognized in pieces, but not in whole, a man whose first 23 years of fatherhood barely got a sentence. I gave my own remarks anyway, briefly, about the man who used to read Dickens badly on Christmas Eve and meant every embarrassing word of it, about a father who showed up at every Little League game, even when the plant was running 3 shifts, about a man whose love language was inconvenient labor performed without complaint. I watched Diane's face while I spoke, composed, gracious, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief that matched her outfit. And I watched Connor's face too, which had a different expression entirely, something closer to calculation than grief, the expression of a man doing math on a timeline he'd clearly already been running for a while. Connor cornered me at the reception afterward, by the coat check, with the particular warmth people perform when they're about to say something self-serving and wanted to land as generous. Listen, Eric, whatever happens with the business stuff, I just want you to know, family's family. I'm sure Dad wanted things to stay stable. I'm happy to keep things running the way they've been going. I remember thinking, even through the fog of that day, how strange it was to hear a man who had never run so much as a single full shift on that factory floor talk about keeping things running, as though stability were a thing he'd built rather than a thing he'd been handed. The will reading was scheduled for 9 days later, which felt both too soon and unbearably far away. In the time between, Diane called me twice, both times to check in, both times steering the conversation, with what I now recognize as practiced ease, toward reassurances about how Walter had always wanted everyone taken care of, and how she hoped we could all handle this like the family he raised us to be. I said the right things back. I didn't yet know what I was agreeing to handle gracefully. What I didn't know, what none of us knew except, I'd later learn, one lawyer in a small office on the other side of town, was that my father had spent his final 14 months quietly, deliberately undoing 15 years of accumulated arrangement, one private signature at a time, in a room Diane had never once been allowed into. The reading took place in Halloran's office, not Greaves', which I noted with quiet interest and which visibly unsettled Diane the moment we sat down. She'd clearly expected Greaves, her own attorney, the man who'd quietly absorbed most of my father's affairs over the previous decade. Instead, an older lawyer I barely remembered from childhood, silver-haired, unhurried, The kind of man who'd clearly decided sometime in the 1990s that his integrity mattered more than his client list, greeted us at the door with a handshake and an expression that gave nothing away. The room was small, paneled in dark wood, with a long table that sat all of us closer together than any of us wanted to be. Diane sat at the head, naturally, in the chair closest to the lawyer, dressed in that tasteful cream I mentioned, her hands folded with the specific calm of someone who has rehearsed an outcome so many times in her head that she's stopped imagining alternatives. Connor sat beside her, in a suit that cost more than my father's first delivery truck. Madison sat across from me, quieter than I expected, picking at a thread on her sleeve. Sarah sat beside me, her hand resting lightly on my knee, the only person in that room who had no stake in the outcome beyond wanting me to survive whatever it turned out to be. Halloran began with the routine portions, the parts that surprised no one. The house went to Diane outright, along with its furnishings, which felt, even to me, entirely appropriate. She'd lived there 15 years. It had been her home as much as anyone's. Personal items were distributed with small, specific notes my father had clearly dictated himself. His father's old watch to Connor, a set of golf clubs to no one in particular, a modest trust for Madison's continuing education. My mother's wedding ring, which I hadn't realized he'd kept, was left to my daughter, with a note that simply read, "For when she's old enough to understand where she comes from." I had to look at the ceiling for a moment after that one. Then Halloran moved to the matter of Donovan fastener and machine, and the room's temperature changed in a way I could feel before anyone said a word. Connor straightened slightly. Diane's folded hands tightened almost imperceptibly around each other. "Walter's instructions regarding the company," Halloran said, "are addressed in a separate document, which he asked me to read in full, in his own words, before any further distribution is discussed." He opened a second folder, thinner than the first, and I watched Diane's composure hold for exactly as long as it took him to clear his throat and begin reading. "If you're hearing this," my father's words began, in Halloran's careful, unhurried voice, "it means I finally found the nerve to do something while I was still alive that I should have done years ago." My father's letter continued for nearly 10 minutes, and I'm going to give you the parts that mattered most, because I've read it perhaps 200 times since, and I still hear it in his voice every time. He wrote that 2 years after marrying Diane, his original attorney, Halloran, before Diane gently but persistently suggested switching to Greaves for efficiency, had flagged something in the marriage's financial structure that bothered him enough to keep a private file on it. Diane's first marriage, it turned out, had ended not simply in divorce, but in a quiet settlement that involved her former husband's family business, a regional auto parts distributor, restructured in her favor during the marriage in ways her former in-laws only fully understood after the fact. Once 2 of the company's 3 locations had been sold off under management decisions Diane had heavily influenced. My father hadn't known this when they married. Halloran had only confirmed it years later, after my father, troubled by a pattern he couldn't quite name, asked him to quietly look into it. "I'm not writing this to punish Diane for her past," the letter said. "People are allowed to survive their own marriages however they need to. But I started watching, after that, for the same pattern in our life. And once you start watching for something, Eric, you start seeing it everywhere it actually is." What he'd seen, over the following years, was a slow, persistent campaign to restructure Donovan Fastener and Machine's ownership in a way that would, on paper, look like routine estate planning and would, in practice, hand controlling interest to Connor while offering me a fair market buyout for my technically equal share, a buyout that, given how privately held manufacturing valuations work, would have paid me roughly 40 cents on the dollar of what the company was actually worth, while Connor inherited control of the real asset outright. Greaves had drafted 3 separate versions of this plan over 6 years, each one presented to my father as simplifying things for everyone, each one quietly increasing Connor's eventual control while decreasing mine. I signed the first version, my father admitted, and I felt something in my chest go cold hearing him say it. I told myself it was fair, because Connor was around more, because you'd built your own thing and didn't need the company the way he seemed to. I believed my own excuse for almost 4 years. I'm ashamed of that, and I don't expect you to forgive it quickly, if you forgive it at all. What changed his mind, he wrote, was that hospital stay. Lying in that bed, watching Diane manage his doctors with the same fluent efficiency she'd once used to manage 3 auto parts dealerships out of her first husband's name. He finally let himself see the pattern whole instead of in pieces. He called Halloran from that cheap prepaid phone the week he was discharged and asked him to quietly, legally, completely unwind every version of the plan Greaves had built and replace it with something simpler. Full ownership and control of Donovan Fastener and Machine, the company he built from a rented garage, left entirely to me. Halloran paused there, looking up from the page for the first time since he'd started reading, giving the room a moment that nobody used well. Diane's face had gone through several stages in those 10 minutes. Composure, confusion, a flicker of something that might have been genuine fear, and had landed somewhere I can only describe as carefully blank, the expression of a woman recalculating a decade of strategy in real time and trying not to let anyone watch her do it. Connor looked like he'd been slapped and was still deciding whether to admit it hurt. Madison, to her credit, was looking at me, not at her mother, with an expression I couldn't quite read, but that wasn't hostile. Halloran continued. The next section of the letter was addressed, my father had specified, directly to me, and Halloran read it without softening a word. Eric, I know what I'm handing you isn't just a company. It's an argument I should have had with myself 30 years ago and didn't, because I was raised by a man who believed conflict in a household was a kind of failure, and some part of me never stopped believing that, even when believing it cost you something real. I told myself silence was peacekeeping. It wasn't. It was just a slower, quieter way of choosing, and I chose wrong more times than I can fix from here. He went on, and this part I've thought about more than almost anything else in my life since. I'm not asking you to be cruel to Diane on your way out the door, even though God knows I understand if some part of you wants to be. She made real mistakes, and I made the bigger one of letting them stand, because confronting them was harder than enduring them. But you've never needed me to tell you how to treat people with more decency than they showed you. Your mother taught you that long before Diane ever walked into our lives, and watching you live it, even when it cost you, has been the proudest, quietest joy of my second life. Take care of the company. Take care of your sister in whatever way she'll let you. And if you ever find yourself about to make the same choice I made, choosing comfort over honesty because honesty feels like it might break something, please, for both our sakes, don't. I didn't cry in that room, though I wanted to badly. I think some old instinct, inherited directly from him, told me not to give Diane the satisfaction of watching me do it in front of her. I saved it for the parking garage, the same one I'd called Halloran from over a year earlier, sitting in my car with Sarah's hand on my arm. Finally, letting out something I think I'd been carrying since I was 16 years old, and watched my mother's casket lowered into ground my father couldn't bring himself to look at directly. Diane found her voice eventually, there in the office, thin and controlled. This isn't what Walter would have wanted, she said, to no one in particular, which struck me, even in that moment, as a strange thing to say about a man whose own recorded voice had just spent 10 minutes explaining exactly what he wanted, in his own words, on his own terms, for the first time in 15 years. I want to pause here for a second, because if you've made it this far with me, you already know this isn't really a story about a will reading. It's a story about what happens when silence gets mistaken for peace for long enough that somebody has to break it from beyond the grave just to set the record straight. If that's landing the way it's landing with me, even now, telling it, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day. We tell these stories because so many of you write in afterward and say, that was my family's house, just with different furniture. And that's really the whole reason I keep sitting down to tell them. Back to that office, because the hardest part of the day hadn't actually happened yet. After Halloran finished reading, the room sat in a silence that felt longer than it probably was. Diane asked, eventually, in a voice that had lost its earlier polish, what this meant for the house, for her standard of living, for the life Walter built for us. Halloran, gently but precisely, explained that the house and its furnishings remained hers outright, as specified, along with a modest continuing allowance my father had arranged separately, sufficient but not extravagant, enough, he'd written, to make sure she's never in want, without making her the gatekeeper of a company she had no part in building. Connor left without saying much of anything, which surprised me less than it probably should have. Madison stayed a few minutes longer, and when we were briefly alone in the hallway, she said something I didn't expect. I always knew it wasn't right, how things got divided, she said quietly. I just never had anywhere to put that, growing up in the house where it was happening. I told her I understood completely, because I did, better than almost anyone. I understood exactly what it costs a kid to watch unfairness happen and have no power to name it. The weeks after the reading were strange in a way grief rarely gets credit for being. I had a company to run that I hadn't run before, full of employees who'd known my father for decades and were watching, carefully, to see what kind of Donovan they'd ended up with. I had a stepbrother who stopped speaking to me entirely, and a stepmother whose lawyer sent 2 strongly worded letters in the first month, neither of which went anywhere, because there wasn't, in the end, anything left to contest. My father had built the new arrangement too carefully, too quietly, over too long a time, for there to be a loose thread left to pull. I made one decision early on that I want to mention, because it mattered more to me than almost anything else in that whole process. I didn't fire a single person Diane or Connor had brought into the company over those years, not out of weakness, but because my father's letter had asked me, explicitly, not to let resentment become the architecture of how I ran things, the same way silence had become the architecture of how he ran his marriage. I let people prove themselves on the floor, the same way I'd had to. Most of them did. A few didn't, and left on their own, which felt like a kind of justice I hadn't had to manufacture myself. About 8 months after the reading, Diane called me, which surprised me almost as much as anything else that year. Her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it, all the polish worn down to something closer to plain exhaustion. She asked if we could talk, in person, and I drove out to the house, my father's house, technically still hers, though it felt strange walking through that door without a minute. She didn't apologize the way I might have written the scene if I were inventing it. She didn't suddenly become a different person. What she said, sitting at that same kitchen table where Christmas Eve had quietly stopped happening years earlier, was something closer to an explanation than an apology. I grew up watching my mother lose everything when my father left, she said. I promised myself I'd never be a woman standing in a kitchen with nothing to show for 30 years of marriage. I think somewhere along the way I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting myself and taking things that weren't mine to take. I didn't forgive her fully that day, and I want to be honest about that, because I think total forgiveness is mostly a thing that happens in stories rather than in actual families. But I told her I understood the fear underneath what she'd done, even if I couldn't excuse everything that fear had justified along the way. We didn't hug. We didn't promise holidays together. But something in that kitchen settled into a kind of quiet, adult peace that didn't require either of us to pretend the last 15 years had been anything other than what they were. I think about my father constantly now, running the company he spent his whole life building, walking the same floor he walked for decades, and what I think about most isn't the unfairness, though I won't pretend that doesn't still surface sometimes, usually at odd moments. A Christmas Eve, a grandchild's birthday, a quiet second where I notice myself instinctively checking whether I'm taking up too much space in a room. What I think about most is the courage it took him, at the very end, frightened and weakened and almost out of time, to finally tell the truth out loud after 30 years of choosing silence, because silence felt safer. I've started reading my kids the same Dickens passage every Christmas Eve now, badly, in a voice that embarrasses them exactly the way my father's embarrassed me. And I do it on purpose, because some traditions are worth resurrecting even, especially after the people who started them are gone. My daughter wears my mother's ring on a chain around her neck, too young still to wear it properly, but old enough now to ask questions about where it came from, and I answer every single one of them honestly, fully, the way nobody in that house answered mine for the better part of 15 years. I don't know if my father ever fully forgave himself for the years he spent choosing comfort over honesty. I know he spent his last 14 months trying to settle the account before it closed for good. I think that's the most any of us can really do once we finally see the pattern we've been living inside clearly enough to name it. Not undo the years we lost to silence, but refuse, finally, to hand that silence down to the people who come after us. My father's office at the plant still has his desk in it, the same scarred oak one he bought secondhand in 1974 and refused to replace even after the company could afford 100 better ones. I sit at it most mornings before the floor opens, in the quiet, before the machines start and the day takes over. And some mornings I still half expect to look up and find him standing in the doorway the way he used to, checking on a son he never quite knew how to check on out loud. I kept the prepaid phone. It's in my desk drawer now, dead, the battery long gone. A cheap plastic relic of the 14 months when an old, tired man finally found the nerve to stop performing peace and start telling the truth instead. I don't need it to work. I just need to know it's there, proof that it's never actually too late to correct course, even when the time left to do it is shorter than anyone wants to admit. My stepmother still smiles the way she always did when I see her, which isn't often and isn't never. It doesn't mean what it used to mean to me. It's just a smile now, worn by a woman who built her whole adult life around never being caught without a plan, finding out, at the worst possible moment, that someone she'd underestimated for 15 years had quietly built one of his own. If this found you tonight, do me a favor. Follow the channel. And if any part of this felt familiar, send it to 5 people who'd understand exactly why. Tell me honestly, in the comments, whether your family has a version of this story too. A will, a wedge, a silence nobody ever quite broke in time. And tell me what story you want to sit down and hear next. I'll be here. Same time, same desk,